Jonas Hale had survived Apache arrows, cavalry charges, and 3 winters that killed stronger men, but nothing prepared him for what he saw that autumn afternoon in 1878. A young widow hanging laundry while her children laughed in the Montana dust. In that single moment, the wandering cowboy glimpsed something he'd stopped believing in: home, but claiming it would cost him everything, because the man who wanted her land dead would soon want Jonas dead too. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The horse beneath Jonas Hale had gone lame 3 miles back, and now limped along the rutted trail with the resigned patience of an animal that knew its working days were numbered. Jonas didn't have the heart to push her harder. They'd covered a lot of ground together, him and this mare, and if this was where their partnership ended, so be it. Everything ended eventually. The Montana Territory stretched before him in endless rolls of golden prairie grass, broken only by the dark line of cottonwoods that marked where a creek cut through the land. October had painted the landscape in shades of amber and rust, and the air carried that particular sharpness that promised winter wasn't far behind. Jonas had no destination in mind. He'd been riding without purpose for the better part of 2 months, ever since mustering out of his last scouting contract with the Army. 28 years old, and he had nothing to show for it but a worn saddle, a rifle that needed a new firing pin, and the kind of weariness that settled into a man's bones and refused to leave. The homestead appeared almost without warning, tucked into a shallow valley where the creek widened into something more substantial. From his vantage point on the rise, Jonas could see it all laid out below. A small cabin constructed of rough-hewn logs, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, a chicken coop, and a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the season. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady column. And there, in the yard between the cabin and the barn, was a woman hanging laundry. Jonas reined in his mare and sat watching, though he couldn't have explained why. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, pulling items from a wicker basket and pinning them to a rope line strung between 2 posts. The wind caught a white sheet and billowed it like a sail, and she wrestled it into submission with movements that suggested she'd fought this particular battle many times before. 2 children played nearby. A boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, was building something with sticks near the woodpile. A little girl, couldn't have been more than 4, twirled in circles with her arms spread wide, her dress spinning around her like a flower. The scene was so ordinary, so perfectly domestic, that Jonas felt something crack open in his chest. He'd seen 1,000 homesteads during his years of scouting, had ridden past countless families making their lives on this hard land, and none of them had ever made him feel like this, like he was looking at something he'd lost before he'd ever had the chance to find it. The mare shifted beneath him, favoring her good legs, and the movement must have caught the woman's attention. Her head turned sharply toward the rise where Jonas sat silhouetted against the afternoon sky. Even from this distance, he could see her body go tense, could see the way her hand dropped to her side where a person might keep a weapon hidden in their skirts. Smart woman. Out here, a stranger on horseback could mean trouble 9 times out of 10. Jonas dismounted slowly, deliberately, keeping his hands visible. He led the mare down the gentle slope toward the homestead, taking his time, trying to look as unthreatening as a 6-foot-tall man with a week's worth of beard and trail dust could look. "That's far enough," the woman called when he was still 30 yards out. Her voice was steady, but Jonas could hear the steel underneath. "State your business." Jonas stopped, looping the mare's reins over his arm. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I don't mean any trouble. My horse came up lame, and we've been walking a good while. I was hoping I might water her at your creek and fill my canteen, that's all." The woman didn't relax. "Creek's free to anyone who needs it. You don't need my permission." "Seems polite to ask, seeing as how it runs through your land." She studied him for a long moment. Jonas stood still and let her look. The boy had abandoned his stick construction and now stood close to his mother's side, watching Jonas with wide eyes. The little girl had stopped twirling and was peering around her mother's skirts. "You come from Fort Benton?" the woman asked. "No, ma'am. Been riding up from the south, more or less. No particular destination in mind." "You got a name?" "Jonas Hale." She absorbed this, her gaze flicking to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, the bedroll tied behind the cantle, the way his clothes hung on a frame that had probably been 20 pounds heavier once upon a time. Reading him like a book, tallying up what kind of man had just ridden onto her property. "Lydia Rowan," she said finally. "This is my homestead." "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Rowan." He paused, noting the past tense in her introduction, the absence of a man anywhere in sight. "Your husband around?" "No." The single word was flat, final. Subject closed. Jonas nodded. He understood loss. You didn't make it through 7 years of frontier military service without becoming intimately acquainted with death and all the empty spaces it left behind. "Well," he said, "I'll just water my horse and be on my way. Thank you for your kindness." He started to turn toward the creek, but Lydia's voice stopped him. "That horse isn't going to carry you much further." Jonas looked back at her. She'd moved slightly, and now he could see her face more clearly. Younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, 26 at most. Dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. Brown eyes that had learned to be cautious. A face that would have been called pretty if it hadn't been so worn down by work and worry. "No, ma'am," he agreed. "I expect she isn't. Nearest town is Crooked Creek, 15 miles north. You planning to walk that far?" Jonas shrugged. "If I have to." Lydia bent down and murmured something to the little girl, who nodded and scampered toward the cabin. The boy remained at his mother's side, his small face serious as he continued to study Jonas. "I've got wood that needs chopping before winter sets in proper," Lydia said. "My late husband was supposed to handle it before, well, it didn't get done. You chop wood for 2 hours, I'll feed you supper and let you sleep in the barn. Your horse can rest up tonight, and you can decide in the morning if she's sound enough to carry you to town." It was a transaction, plain and simple. Labor in exchange for food and shelter. No charity, no pity. Jonas appreciated that. "That's more than fair, ma'am. I accept." "Woodpile's there," she said, pointing to the area near where the boy had been playing. "Axe is stuck in the chopping block. I expect you know what to do with it." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mr. Hale? My children will be nearby, and I'll have my late husband's rifle inside the cabin. I'm a good shot, just so we understand each other." Jonas met her eyes squarely. "We understand each other just fine, Mrs. Rowan." Something flickered across her face, not quite approval, but maybe a slight easing of tension. She nodded once and turned back to her laundry, and Jonas led his mare toward the creek. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and the mare drank deeply while Jonas knelt and filled his canteen. He splashed water on his face and neck, washing away some of the trail dust, then led the horse to the small corral attached to the barn. There was another horse inside, a sturdy-looking bay gelding that eyed them with mild interest. Jonas stripped the saddle and blanket from his mare, checked her leg carefully. She'd strained something in the left foreleg, nothing broken, but she needed rest, and made sure she had access to water and the hay that was piled in one corner. The axe was exactly where Lydia had said it would be, its blade embedded in a scarred chopping block surrounded by scattered wood that needed splitting. Jonas pulled it free, tested the edge with his thumb, and set to work. The rhythm came back to him immediately, as natural as breathing. Lift the axe, let it fall, let the weight of the blade do most of the work. The wood split clean, the sharp crack of it echoing across the yard. Jonas lost himself in the simple repetitive labor, the way he always did when there was physical work to be done. It kept the mind quiet, kept the memories at bay. He'd been at it for maybe 20 minutes when he sensed he was being watched. Jonas didn't break his rhythm, but he let his eyes flick toward the cabin. The boy was sitting on the front steps, his chin propped on his hands, staring at Jonas with unabashed curiosity. Jonas gave him a slight nod and kept working. After a while, the boy stood and wandered closer, maintaining a careful distance but close enough to talk. "You been in the army?" the boy asked. Jonas set another log on the block. "I have. My pa was in the army. He was a sergeant." "That's so? That's a good rank. Takes a solid man to make sergeant." The boy puffed up a little at that. "He was a good soldier. Ma says so." "I believe it." Jonas split the log, added the pieces to the growing pile. "What's your name, son?" Caleb Rowan." "I'm 7. 7's a good age, old enough to start learning useful things." "Like what?" "Like chopping wood, for one. You ever swing an axe?" Caleb shook his head. Ma says I'm too little still. Well, your ma's probably right, but there's other things you can do. You want to help me stack this wood? That's important work. Wood stacked right will stay dry all winter. Wood stacked wrong will rot and be useless when you need it most. The boy's face lit up. I can stack it good. I'm real careful. I bet you are. Come on then. I'll show you how. For the next half hour, Jonas chopped and Caleb stacked, and Jonas explained the principles of building a proper woodpile. Bark side down to shed water, gaps for air circulation, higher in the middle so snow would slide off. Caleb listened with intense concentration and asked smart questions, and Jonas found himself enjoying the boy's company more than he'd expected. The little girl appeared after a while, drawn by the sound of their voices. She stood several feet away, watching them with enormous blue eyes, one finger stuck in her mouth. That's my sister Molly, Caleb announced. She's 4 and she don't talk much. Nothing wrong with that, Jonas said. He smiled at the girl. Hello there, Molly. She didn't respond, just continued staring at him with those big eyes. Then she pulled her finger from her mouth and held up 4 fingers. 4 years old, huh? That's what I heard. Bet you're pretty helpful around here. Molly nodded solemnly. She helps Ma with the chickens, Caleb offered. She's real good at finding eggs. Sometimes the hens hide them in the corners and you gotta look careful, but Molly always finds them. That's an important job. Can't have a proper breakfast without eggs. Molly's face broke into a sudden, brilliant smile, and Jonas felt that crack in his chest open a little wider. They worked until the sun started its slide toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jonas had split enough wood to last a good 2 weeks, maybe more, and Caleb had stacked it all neatly against the side of the barn. Molly had helped by carrying small pieces that had split off from the larger logs, adding them to a separate pile that would be good for kindling. Lydia emerged from the cabin just as Jonas was hanging the axe back on its peg near the barn. Supper's ready, she announced. Caleb, Molly, go wash your hands. The children ran for the cabin, and Lydia approached Jonas, her eyes going to the enormous woodpile. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. Maybe both. That's more than 2 hours of work, she said quietly. Jonas shrugged. Wood needed chopping, made sense to finish the job properly. Still, thank you. No thanks necessary, ma'am. Fair trade for a meal and a place to sleep. She looked at him for a long moment, and Jonas had the sense she was recalculating something, adjusting her assessment of him. You were a scout, weren't you? Not regular army. Jonas raised an eyebrow. How'd you figure that? The way you move. Quiet. Careful. You watch everything, but don't seem to be watching anything. My husband worked with some scouts during his service. They all had that same quality. Your husband was a good observer. Yes, she said softly. He was. An awkward silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of grief Jonas didn't know how to address. He cleared his throat. I should wash up before supper. There's a basin and water by the back door. Soap, too. Much obliged. Inside the cabin was simple but well kept. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. A rough-hewn table with 4 chairs sat in the center, and a cast-iron stove stood against the far wall, radiating warmth. 2 doors led to what Jonas assumed were bedrooms. The place was clean and organized, everything in its proper place, but there was a worn quality to it all, a sense of things being stretched thin, used past their prime, but maintained with stubborn care. The meal was simple: salt pork fried with potatoes, beans, and cornbread. Nothing fancy, but it was hot and plentiful, and Jonas realized he hadn't eaten anything but hardtack and jerky in 3 days. He ate slowly, mindful of his manners, while Caleb chattered about the wood they'd stacked and how Jonas had taught him the proper way to do it. Molly ate in silence, occasionally sneaking glances at Jonas when she thought he wasn't looking. Lydia ate little, mostly pushing food around her plate while watching her children with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. Love certainly, but also something that looked like fear. Like she was afraid of how happy Caleb seemed, how animated. Like happiness itself was dangerous. Mr. Hale was in the army, Ma, Caleb announced around a mouthful of cornbread. Just like Pa. I heard, Lydia said. Did you fight Indians? Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Caleb, Lydia said sharply. That's not polite dinner conversation. It's all right, ma'am, Jonas said. I was a scout, Caleb, not a fighter. My job was to find safe paths through dangerous territory and help keep people from getting lost or ambushed. Sometimes that meant dealing with hostile parties, but mostly it meant a lot of riding and watching and reporting what I saw. Did you see any buffalo? Thousands of them, great herds that stretched from one horizon to the other, so many they made the ground shake when they ran. I seen a buffalo once, Caleb said. It was big as a barn. Not quite that big, Lydia interjected, but close enough. After supper, Jonas helped clear the table despite Lydia's protests, then excused himself to the barn while she put the children to bed. The structure smelled of hay and horses and old wood, comforting smells that reminded Jonas of a dozen different places he'd slept over the years. He spread his bedroll in an empty stall, checked on his mare one more time, and lay down fully clothed with his rifle within easy reach. Through the barn's gaps, he could see lamplight glowing in the cabin windows. He heard Lydia's voice muffled by distance, probably reading to her children or singing them to sleep. The wind picked up, rattling the barn's loose boards, carrying the scent of distant snow. Jonas closed his eyes and tried not to think about how good it had felt to chop wood while children played nearby, to sit at a family table and share a meal, to be, for just a few hours, part of something larger than himself. Tried not to think about how much he'd wanted to say yes when Caleb had asked if he'd ever seen buffalo, had wanted to tell the boy stories about everything he'd witnessed in his years of wandering. Tried not to think about how Lydia Rowan had looked standing in her yard with the afternoon sun turning her hair to burnished copper, how she'd held herself with the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving things that would have broken weaker people. Tried not to think about how much he didn't want to leave in the morning, but wanting things and having them were two different matters entirely, and Jonas had learned long ago not to confuse the two. He was nearly asleep when he heard the barn door creak open. Jonas's hand went to his rifle automatically, but he relaxed when he saw Lydia's silhouette in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold. "Mr. Hale, you awake?" "I am now, ma'am." Jonas sat up, running a hand through his hair. "Something wrong." She hesitated, and in that pause, Jonas heard everything she wasn't saying. Heard the loneliness, the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of carrying too much weight for too long. "I wanted to ask," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "how long you'd been riding without a destination." Jonas considered lying, then decided against it. 2 months, give or take. Running from something or running toward something? Neither, just running. Lydia stepped into the barn, close enough now that Jonas could see her face in the shadows. She looked older in the dim light, the lines around her eyes more pronounced, but also somehow more vulnerable. "The homestead needs work," she said, "more than I can handle on my own. The barn's got a leak in the roof, half the fence line is down, and I need at least 2 more cords of wood before winter really hits. I can't pay you money. I barely have enough to see us through to spring, but I can feed you 3 meals a day and give you a place to sleep. If you stayed on for a week, maybe 2, you could get everything squared away before the snow comes." Jonas's heart kicked against his ribs. "Mrs. Rowan, I know what you're thinking," she interrupted. "People will talk. A widow woman and a single man, no matter how proper the arrangement. But I'm past caring what people think, and you don't strike me as the kind of man who puts much stock in gossip either. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I need help, and you're here. That's all." It wasn't all, though. Jonas could see it in her eyes, in the set of her shoulders. She was desperate. And desperation made people do things they wouldn't normally do, like trust a stranger who'd ridden onto their property with nothing more than a lame horse and a handful of words. He should say no. Should mount up in the morning and ride for Crooked Creek, find some saloon or boarding house that needed temporary help, keep moving the way he'd been moving for months, years, his whole life, really. "1 week, Jonas heard himself say. "I'll get your repairs done and then I'll move on. But I'll need to check my mare's leg each day. If it's worse than I think, I might need to stay longer until she's sound enough to ride, or until I can work out another arrangement." Relief flooded Lydia's features, so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, Mr. Hale. You have no idea what this means." But Jonas thought maybe he did. Thought maybe he understood exactly what it meant to be drowning and have someone throw you a rope, even if you were too proud to admit you needed one. "Get some sleep, ma'am," he said gently. "Morning comes early on a homestead." "Yes?" she said, already turning toward the door. "Yes, it does." She paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "Mr. Hale? My children. They lost their father 8 months ago. Caleb especially. He's at that age where he needs... Well, just be careful with him, please. He gets attached easily." "I understand," Jonas said, though his chest was tight with implications he didn't want to examine too closely. "Good night, then." "Night, ma'am." After she left, Jonas lay back down and stared up at the barn's shadowy rafters. 1 week, maybe 2 at most, that was all. He'd help Lydia get the place ready for winter, make sure she and her children would be safe and warm, and then he'd ride on to wherever the road took him next. It was a good plan, a solid plan. So why did it feel like he was lying to himself? Outside, the wind picked up, and the first fat snowflakes of the season began to fall, drifting down from the dark sky like white ash from a fire that had burned too long. Inside the cabin, Lydia's lamp went out, and the homestead settled into silence broken only by the creak of old wood and the soft sounds of horses moving in their stalls. Jonas pulled his blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. He kept seeing Lydia's face when she'd asked for his help, kept hearing Caleb's excited voice as they'd stacked wood together, kept feeling that strange, dangerous warmth that had opened up in his chest when Molly had smiled at him. 1 week, he told himself, 2 at most. But even as he thought it, somewhere deep inside where he kept all his most carefully guarded truths, Jonas knew he was already in trouble. The kind of trouble that started with chopping wood and ended with roots growing so deep they'd be impossible to pull up without tearing something vital loose. The kind of trouble that looked an awful lot like home. The week Jonas had promised turned into 2, then 3, and somehow autumn deepened into early winter without either of them mentioning his departure again. The work consumed his days in the best possible way. Jonas fixed the barn roof, replacing rotted shingles and ceiling gaps that had let rain and snow seep through for God knew how long. He rode the fence line on Lydia's bay gelding, a steady animal named Buck, and spent days repairing posts and restringing wire. He split more wood until the pile stood taller than Caleb, then split some more because winter in Montana territory didn't care about a man's good intentions. And through it all, Caleb followed him like a shadow. The boy appeared every morning the moment Jonas emerged from the barn, his face scrubbed clean and his eyes bright with anticipation. He handed Jonas tools without being asked, held fence posts steady while Jonas hammered them into the frozen ground, and asked an endless stream of questions that Jonas found himself answering with more patience than he'd known he possessed. "Why do you check the fence every day?" Caleb asked one morning as they rode Buck together along the property line. Caleb perched in front of Jonas on the saddle. "Because cattle or horses can push through a weak spot, and then you've got animals wandering off where they shouldn't be. Out here, livestock is survival. Lose them, and you lose everything. We don't got cattle." "Not yet, maybe. But your ma's got that milk cow, and she's worth protecting. Besides, good fences make for good neighbors. Keeps disputes from starting." Caleb considered this seriously. "Mr. Briggs don't care about good fences." Jonas's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. He'd heard that name twice now, once from Lydia in passing, and once from a neighboring homesteader Jonas had encountered while working the north fence line. Harlan Briggs, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, a man who'd apparently made it clear he wanted Lydia's land and didn't take kindly to being refused. "Your ma had trouble with Briggs?" Jonas asked carefully. "He came here after Pa died. Told Ma she should sell and move to town, that this ain't no place for a woman alone. Ma said no. She said Pa built this place for us and she wasn't leaving. Mr. Briggs got real mad. His face turned all red and he yelled." Jonas felt something cold settle in his gut. "When was this? 3 months ago, maybe? I don't remember exactly, but Ma told him to get off our land and she had Pa's rifle loaded. He left, but he said she'd regret it. He said winter would change her mind." "Did he come back?" "No, sir, but his men ride past sometimes. They don't stop, but they look at everything real careful like. Ma says to stay inside when they come by. Jonas nodded slowly, filing this information away. Your ma's smart. You listen to her. I always do, Caleb said, then added with the brutal honesty of childhood. Well, mostly. Despite himself, Jonas smiled. Molly warmed to him more slowly, but in her own way. She didn't speak to him. Apparently she barely spoke at all, Lydia had explained, not since her father died. But she watched him constantly. Jonas would look up from whatever task occupied his hands and find her sitting nearby, her doll clutched to her chest, those enormous blue eyes tracking his every movement. One afternoon, while Jonas was mending harness leather on the porch, she approached him with slow, careful steps, like a wild animal deciding whether to trust. She held something in her closed fist. What have you got there, Miss Molly? Jonas asked softly, not looking directly at her. She opened her hand to reveal 3 smooth stones, each one different, gray, white, and a deep russet red. Those are mighty fine stones. Did you find them by the creek? She nodded. The red one's especially nice. That's jasper, I think. Indians used to use stones like that for making tools and arrowheads. Molly's eyes widened. Slowly, deliberately, she set all 3 stones on the porch boards next to Jonas's boot, then backed away. For me? Jonas asked. Another nod. Well, that's just about the kindest gift I've received in a long time. Thank you, Miss Molly. I'll keep these somewhere safe. She smiled, that same brilliant, heartbreaking smile, and ran off toward the chicken coop. Jonas picked up the stones and turned them over in his calloused palm, feeling their smoothness, their weight. Such a small gesture, but it lodged itself somewhere deep in his chest alongside all the other small moments that were accumulating despite his best efforts to remain detached. He slipped the stones into his pocket and went back to work. Lydia herself remained distant in a way Jonas understood. She was cordial, always polite, but she maintained careful boundaries. She didn't join him and the children during the day, except to call them in for meals or chores. She didn't linger in conversation. When Jonas caught her watching him, which happened more often than either of them acknowledged, she'd look away quickly, as though she'd been caught doing something improper. But slowly, incrementally, the walls began to lower. It started with small things. She began asking his opinion on practical matters, whether the milk cow seemed healthy, if the chicken coop would hold through heavy snow, how much grain she needed to lay in for winter. She stopped tensing quite so much when he came through the door for meals. Once, Jonas heard her laugh at something Caleb said, a sound so unexpected and genuine it stopped him mid-motion, his hammer frozen in the air. Then came the evening, everything shifted. Jonas was in the barn currying buck when Lydia appeared in the doorway. The sun had already set, and lamplight from the cabin threw long shadows across the yard. Mr. Hale, could I speak with you a moment? Of course, ma'am. Jonas set down the brush and gave Buck a final pat. Something wrong? Not wrong, exactly. Just... She twisted her hands together, uncharacteristically uncertain. Tomorrow is Caleb's birthday. He'll be 8. I've been saving eggs to make him a cake, and I traded some preserves to Mrs. Henderson for sugar, but what, ma'am? He's been talking about you teaching him to hunt. He asked if maybe for his birthday you might take him out to see if you could find a rabbit or grouse, something we could cook for a special dinner. Her words came faster now, almost apologetic. I know it's an imposition, and you've already done so much, and I shouldn't ask. I'd be happy to take him, Jonas interrupted gently. It'd be my pleasure. Lydia's shoulders sagged with relief. Really? You don't mind? Not even a little. A boy turning 8 ought to learn about hunting. It's a useful skill, especially out here. His father was going to teach him. Had promised to, that spring. But then... She trailed off, leaving the obvious unspoken. I'm sorry, Jonas said, because what else could he say? So am I. Lydia looked down at her hands. Caleb took it hard. They were close, and he doesn't understand why his father had to die. I've tried to explain, but how do you explain pneumonia to a 7-year-old? How do you make senseless death make sense? You can't, Jonas said quietly. You just learn to carry it. She looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Jonas saw recognition in her eyes, saw her understanding that he knew about carrying loss, about the weight of absence. Were you married, Mr. Hale? No, ma'am. Never had that privilege. But you lost people. Everyone loses people. That's just the cost of living. Lydia wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Sometimes the cost seems too high. Sometimes it is, Jonas agreed, but we pay it anyway because the alternative is not living at all. They stood in silence for a moment, the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who understand each other's scars. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, its lonely voice echoing across the prairie. I should get back inside, Lydia said finally. The children will wonder where I am. Mrs. Rowan, Jonas said as she turned to leave. For what it's worth, you're doing a fine job with those kids. Your husband would be proud. Even in the dim light, he could see her eyes grow bright with unshed tears. Thank you, Mr. Hale. That means more than you know. After she left, Jonas stood in the barn for a long time, listening to the horses breathe in the darkness, feeling the weight of Molly's stones in his pocket, like a promise he hadn't meant to make. The next morning, Jonas woke Caleb before dawn. The boy tumbled out of bed already half-dressed, his excitement barely contained. Lydia had packed them bread and cheese and a canteen of water, and she handed Jonas his rifle with a look that said everything about trust and fear and the terrible responsibility of letting her son go into the world with a near stranger. We'll be back before noon, Jonas promised. I'll keep him safe. I know you will, Lydia said, and Jonas felt the weight of that faith like a stone around his neck. They walked north toward a stand of mixed pine and aspen where Jonas had seen signs of game, rabbit tracks, grouse droppings, the telltale marks of deer. The morning was cold and clear, their breath fogging in the air, frost crunching under their boots. Walking quiet is the first lesson, Jonas murmured as they entered the tree line. Game animals got better hearing than you can imagine. A snapped twig can spook them from 100 yards away. So you step careful, and you watch where you put your feet. Caleb nodded seriously, his eyes huge with concentration, and Jonas felt something twist in his chest. The boy was trying so hard to be good, to do everything right, to make Jonas proud. It was almost unbearable. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Jonas pointing out tracks, showing Caleb how to read the forest signs. A tuft of fur caught on bark. A scrape mark where deer had rubbed their antlers, the distinctive three-toed tracks of wild turkey. Caleb absorbed it all with the fierce attention of a child starved for this kind of knowledge, this kind of masculine attention. It was Jonas who spotted the rabbit, a fat cottontail nibbling at dried grass in a small clearing. He put a hand on Caleb's shoulder and pointed. The boy's breath caught. Jonas raised the rifle slowly, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the cold air, and the rabbit dropped instantly, a clean kill. Caleb's face lit up like the sun. You got him! You got him! We got him, Jonas corrected. This is your birthday hunt, remember? They walked to where the rabbit lay, and Jonas showed Caleb how to field dress the kill, explaining each step, making sure the boy understood the respect owed to an animal that would feed them. It wasn't easy work, and Caleb turned a little green around the edges, but he didn't look away. Taking a life is serious business, Jonas said as he worked. Even a rabbit's life. You don't do it for sport or meanness. You do it for food, for survival, and you do it as clean and quick as you can. That's the hunter's responsibility. Understand? Yes, sir, Caleb said solemnly. I understand. Good man. On the walk back, Caleb carried the dressed rabbit with both hands, his chest puffed out with pride. Jonas watched him and thought about his own 8th birthday, spent in an orphanage in Missouri where birthdays didn't exist, and the only lessons learned were about survival of a different kind entirely. When they crested the rise and the homestead came into view, Caleb suddenly grabbed Jonas's hand. The contact was so unexpected, so trusting, that Jonas nearly stumbled. Thank you, Mr. Hale, the boy said, looking up at him with David Rowan's eyes in David Rowan's son's face. This is the best birthday ever. Jonas swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. You're welcome, Caleb. Happy birthday. That evening, they roasted the rabbit, and Lydia made the promised cake. A simple thing sweetened with precious sugar and topped with berry preserves. And they sang, and Caleb blew out 8 candles made from tallow. The cabin felt warm and full in a way Jonas imagined it hadn't felt since David Rowan died. And when Molly fell asleep against Jonas's shoulder after dinner, he didn't have the heart to move her. I should put her to bed, Lydia said softly, but she didn't immediately reach for her daughter. "She's all right here for a minute," Jonas said. The little girl's weight against him felt right in a way that terrified him. Caleb was already nodding off in his chair, exhausted from the day's excitement and the full meal. Lydia stood and gathered him up despite his sleepy protests, carrying him toward the bedroom with the practiced ease of motherhood. When she returned, Jonas carefully transferred Molly to her arms. Their hands touched briefly in the exchange, and Lydia's eyes met his. Something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," she whispered. "For today. For all of it. Wasn't any trouble." "Yes, it was. But you did it anyway." She paused, Molly's head resting on her shoulder. "You're good with them. Better than... You're just good with them." Jonas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Lydia carried Molly to bed, and Jonas let himself out into the cold night, walking back to the barn with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, one of them closing around 3 smooth stones. November gave way to early December, and the first real snow fell, blanketing the homestead in white that made everything look clean and new and deceptively peaceful. Jonas had meant to leave a dozen times by now, but there was always one more thing that needed doing, one more repair that couldn't wait until spring. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was harder to face. He didn't want to leave. The homestead had become something he'd stopped believing could exist. A place where he was needed, where his presence mattered, where 3 people looked at him with something other than suspicion or indifference. It was dangerous, this feeling. Dangerous and foolish and bound to end badly. But Jonas couldn't quite make himself care enough to leave. Then Harlan Briggs came back. Jonas was repairing the corral fence when he heard horses. He looked up to see 3 riders approaching from the north, 2 ranch hands flanking a big man on a black gelding that probably cost more than everything Jonas owned twice over. Briggs himself was in his 50s, thick through the middle but still powerful, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once before entitlement and cruelty had carved it into something harder. He sat his horse like the man who owned everything he surveyed and most of what he didn't. The 2 ranch hands were younger, lean and hard-eyed, their hands resting casually near the guns at their hips. Jonas recognized the type, men who did the kind of work that didn't get discussed in polite company. Caleb had been helping Jonas with the fence, but at the sight of the riders, the boy went pale and took an involuntary step backward. "Go get your mother," Jonas said quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. "Quick now." Caleb ran. Jonas set down his hammer and straightened, very deliberately not reaching for the rifle leaning against the fence post nearby. He waited as the 3 riders pulled up about 10 feet away, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. "Help you gentlemen with something?" Jonas asked mildly. Briggs ignored him, his eyes scanning the homestead, the repaired barn, the stacked wood, the mended fences. His mouth tightened. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Name's Jonas Hale. I work here." "Work here?" Briggs' laugh was harsh. "The widow Rowan hire herself a hand? That's interesting, considering she told me she couldn't afford to keep the place running. Seems she was mistaken about that." One of the ranch hands shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. Jonas tracked the movement with peripheral vision while keeping his eyes on Briggs. The cabin door opened and Lydia emerged, her rifle held at a careful angle, not quite pointed at the riders, but close enough to make the threat clear. She positioned herself on the porch with Caleb behind her, Molly nowhere to be seen. "Mr. Briggs," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the color high on her cheeks. "I don't recall inviting you onto my property." "Your property," Briggs's tone dripped contempt. "For now, maybe. But come spring when your money runs out and your hired hand moves on, we'll see how long you last." "That's my concern, not yours." "Everything in this territory is my concern, Mrs. Rowan. I own or control 20,000 acres, and your pathetic 240 sites right in the middle of my best grazing land. You're a stone in my boot, and sooner or later I will remove you." Jonas took a step forward. It wasn't a big movement, barely noticeable, but all 3 riders' attention snapped to him immediately. "You've delivered your message," Jonas said quietly. "Time to ride on." Briggs's eyes narrowed as he studied Jonas more carefully. "You got a lot of spine for a hired hand. What's your stake in this, Hale?" "Mrs. Rowan's business is her own, but while I'm here, anyone wanting to cause trouble will have to go through me first." That's so. The ranch hand on the right grinned, showing yellow teeth. That don't seem too difficult, friend. Maybe not, Jonas agreed. But I guarantee it won't be as easy as you think. And even if you win, Briggs here will still be one man short come morning. Maybe two. You boys willing to die for his grazing land? The grins faded. The ranch hands looked at Briggs, uncertain now. Briggs's face had gone red. You threatening me? No, sir. Just stating facts. Mrs. Rowan has made clear she's not selling. That means this conversation is over. For a long moment, no one moved. The tension stretched tight as fence wire, one wrong word away from snapping into violence. Jonas kept his breathing slow and even, his weight balanced, ready to move. He was acutely aware of Lydia and Caleb behind him, of Molly somewhere inside the cabin, of how many different ways this could go wrong. Then Briggs yanked his horse's head around hard enough to make the animal dance. This isn't finished, he said, pointing at Lydia. You hear me, woman? This isn't close to finished. Get off my land, Lydia said coldly. Now. Briggs wheeled his horse and spurred it into a canter, his men following. They disappeared over the rise heading north, and the sound of hoofbeats faded slowly into silence. Jonas didn't relax until they were completely out of sight. When he finally turned back to the cabin, Lydia was lowering her rifle with shaking hands. You shouldn't have done that, she said, but her voice carried no conviction. He'll remember. He'll come after you now, too. Let him remember. Let him come. Jonas climbed the porch steps, his eyes searching her face. You all right? I'm fine. I'm used to his threats. But the tremor in her hands said otherwise. Caleb was pressed against his mother's side, his face white. Is he going to hurt us, Ma? No, baby. He's just an angry man making noise. Lydia stroked her son's hair, her eyes never leaving Jonas's face. Right, Mr. Hale? Jonas wanted to reassure them, wanted to promise nothing bad would happen. But he'd been living on the frontier too long to make promises he couldn't keep. I won't let anyone hurt you, he said instead. Not while I'm here. It wasn't quite a promise, but it was close enough. Lydia heard the distinction, and something complicated moved across her face, relief and fear, and something else Jonas was afraid to identify. That night, after the children were asleep, Jonas stood watch outside the cabin until well past midnight, his rifle across his knees and Molly's stones in his pocket. He watched the horizon for riders who didn't come, and thought about threats and promises and the difference between wanting something and being able to keep it. The next morning at breakfast, neither Jonas nor Lydia mentioned leaving. The week he'd promised had long since passed, the 2 weeks extended beyond memory. Now they simply didn't speak of it at all, as though naming his eventual departure might make it real. Instead, they fell into rhythms. Jonas worked the homestead, making it stronger, more secure. Lydia managed the household and taught the children their letters. Caleb shadowed Jonas during the day. Molly brought him stones and acorns, and once, inexplicably, a perfectly preserved bird's nest. In the evenings, they ate together, and Jonas taught Caleb to whittle, while Lydia mended clothes and Molly played with her doll. It was domestic and peaceful, and everything Jonas had never known he wanted. It was also a lie, or at least an unsustainable truth, and Jonas knew it. Sooner or later, Briggs would make good on his threats. Sooner or later, winter would end and Jonas would have to decide what he was doing, who he was to this family, whether he was staying or going, and what either choice would cost. But for now, in the cold December twilight with snow falling soft outside and the cabin warm with lamplight and the sound of children's laughter, Jonas let himself pretend. Let himself imagine this could last. Let himself be, just for a little while. The man Caleb thought he was, and the partner Lydia was beginning to hope for. It couldn't last forever. Nothing ever did. But maybe, Jonas thought as Molly climbed into his lap with a book she wanted him to read, maybe forever wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just this moment, and the next one, and all the small moments that added up to something that looked almost like a life. He opened the book and began to read. And outside the window, the snow continued to fall like a benediction on a home that had, against all odds, become his. Christmas came to the homestead wrapped in silence and snow 3 feet deep. Jonas had never celebrated the holiday properly. Orphanages didn't have much use for sentiment, and the army even less, but Lydia was determined to give her children something bright, in the midst of winter's darkness. She'd been planning for weeks, squirreling away small treats and working late into the night on gifts she thought Jonas couldn't see. But he saw everything, the way her lamp burned past midnight, the careful way she hid scraps of fabric and bits of carved wood, the excited whispers between her and the children that stopped abruptly whenever he entered the room. On Christmas Eve morning, Jonas rode Buck 5 miles through the snow to the stand of pine trees he'd scouted weeks earlier. He chose carefully, looking for the right shape and size, finally settling on a young fir that stood just tall enough to brush the cabin's ceiling. It took him an hour to cut it down and drag it back, and by the time he wrestled it through the door, his face was numb with cold and his hands ached despite his gloves. Caleb's shout of pure joy made every frozen minute worth it. "A Christmas tree! Ma, look! Mr. Hale brought us a Christmas tree!" Lydia emerged from the bedroom, flour dusting her apron, and stopped dead at the sight of the fur dominating her small living space. Her hand went to her mouth, and for a terrible moment Jonas thought he'd overstepped, had presumed too much. Then her eyes filled with tears. "David always brought us a tree," she whispered. "Always. Even that last year when he was already sick, he went out in the snow and brought one back. I thought—" She shook her head, unable to finish. Jonas stood there awkwardly, melting snow pooling at his feet, the tree still in his arms. "I can take it back outside if you'd rather not." "Don't you dare!" Lydia crossed the room quickly, reaching out to touch one of the branches. "Don't you dare, Jonas Hale. This is the kindest thing anyone's done for us in longer than I can remember." It was the first time she'd used his Christian name, and the sound of it in her voice did something to his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. They spent the afternoon making decorations from whatever they could find. Lydia produced strings of dried berries she'd been saving, and Jonas helped Caleb carve simple stars from scraps of wood while Molly folded paper into shapes that might have been birds or angels or simply the abstract art of a 4-year-old imagination. They strung it all on the tree with bits of thread and wire. And when they were finished, it wasn't much by city standards, but in that small cabin it looked like something out of a dream. That evening, after the children were asleep, Jonas and Lydia sat by the fire while the tree stood sentinel in the corner, its decorations casting strange shadows on the walls. "I haven't thanked you properly," Lydia said quietly, "for staying, for everything you've done here." "No thanks necessary. I've had food and shelter. That's payment enough." "Is it?" She turned to look at him, the firelight painting her face in warm tones. "Because it seems to me you could have that anywhere. There are towns, ranches, 100 places that would hire a man with your skills. Yet you're still here, sleeping in a cold barn, working yourself half to death for a widow woman who can't pay you a dime." Jonas stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "Maybe I got tired of moving. Or maybe," Lydia said softly, "you found something worth staying for." The air between them felt charged, dangerous. Jonas knew he should deflect, should make a joke or change the subject, or do anything except sit here feeling the weight of her words settle over him like snow. "Lydia, don't." She held up a hand. "Don't explain or apologize or tell me all the reasons this is complicated. I know it's complicated. I've known from the moment I saw you on that horse that you were going to complicate everything." She laughed, but it was a shaky sound. "David's been gone 8 months, and I know what people would say about me, even considering, but I don't care anymore, Jonas. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of being afraid, and my children deserve better than a mother who's too scared to reach for happiness when it shows up on her doorstep." Jonas turned to face her fully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying stay. Not as a hired hand, not as a temporary fix. Stay as—" She faltered, her courage wavering. "Stay as whatever you want to be to us. But please, just stay." Every rational part of Jonas's mind screamed warnings. He barely knew this woman. He'd been here less than 3 months. He had no money, no prospects, nothing to offer her except a strong back and a willingness to work. What kind of foundation was that for a life? But then he thought about Caleb's face when they'd brought back that rabbit, thought about Molly's stones warming in his pocket, thought about the way this cabin had started to feel less like shelter and more like home. The way these people had started to feel less like obligation and more like family. "I'm not an easy man, Lydia," he said finally. I've got history I don't talk about and habits that might drive you crazy. I've been alone most of my life, and I don't know if I'm any good at being part of something." "None of us are good at it at first," Lydia replied. "We just learn as we go. And if I fail, if I let you down, then we'll deal with it together." She reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers small and warm in his. "I'm not asking for promises you can't keep, Jonas. I'm just asking you to try. To be here, with us, and see what happens." Jonas looked down at their joined hands, at the way her fingers laced through his like they'd been doing it for years. It should have felt strange, wrong, too fast. Instead, it felt inevitable, like the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he'd been assembling. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll stay. For as long as you'll have me." Lydia's smile was like sunrise, breaking across her face and lighting up everything in its path. She squeezed his hand once, hard, then released it and stood. "I should check on the children," she said, her voice not quite steady. "And you should get some rest. Tomorrow's Christmas, and Caleb will have us all up at dawn." "Lydia?" Jonas called as she reached the bedroom door. "Yeah?" "Thank you for taking a chance on a stranger." She looked back at him, her hand on the doorframe, her expression soft. "You stopped being a stranger about 2 hours after you got here, Jonas. You just didn't know it yet." After she closed the door, Jonas sat by the fire for a long time, watching the flames burn down to embers, feeling the weight of the decision he'd just made. He'd committed to something bigger than himself, something that required him to be more than he'd ever been before. It was terrifying. It was also the best thing he'd ever done. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, and true to Lydia's prediction, Caleb dragged everyone out of bed before the sun had fully crested the horizon. The children tore into their presents with appropriate enthusiasm. A carved horse for Caleb that Jonas had worked on in secret, a rag doll with a new dress for Molly, and for both of them, peppermint sticks Lydia had traded precious eggs to obtain. Jonas hadn't expected anything for himself, which made it all the more surprising when Lydia handed him a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "You didn't have to open it," she insisted. Inside was a shirt made from fabric that looked suspiciously like curtains that had hung in the cabin when he'd first arrived. The stitching was careful and precise, and when he held it up, he realized she'd sized it perfectly to his frame. "Your other shirt's got more patches than original fabric," Lydia said, a slight flush on her cheeks. "Figured you could use a new one." Jonas ran his thumb over the seams, imagining all the hours she'd spent on this, the way she'd measured him with her eyes, the care she'd taken. "It's perfect," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you." "There's something else," Caleb piped up, bouncing with barely contained excitement. "Show him, Ma." Lydia shot her son a look that promised they'd discuss his inability to keep secrets, but she reached behind the tree and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. When Jonas unwrapped it, he found himself holding a gun belt and holster, old but well-maintained, with initials carved into the leather. DR. "It was David's," Lydia said quietly. "He'd want someone to use it, someone who'd take care of his family." She paused, her eyes meeting Jonas's. "Someone like you." The weight of it was more than leather and metal. It was trust, acceptance, a passing of responsibility from one man to another across the unbridgeable distance of death. Jonas traced the carved initials with his finger. "I'll take care of them," he said, and it was a vow. "I swear it." "I know you will." The rest of December passed in a haze of cold and work and small domestic moments that Jonas hoarded like gold. Lydia's walls came down inch by inch, and Jonas found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about the orphanage, about his years with the army, about the loneliness that had followed him like a shadow for as long as he could remember. She shared too, late at night when the children were asleep and they sat by the fire. She told him about David, about their courtship and marriage, about the dream they'd shared of building something lasting. She told him about the terror of being left alone, about nights when she'd sat up with her father's rifle across her lap, jumping at every sound, convinced that Briggs or winter or simple bad luck would take everything she had left. "I was drowning," she admitted one night, "just barely keeping my head above water. And then you rode up that hill and I thought, here's another problem I don't need. Another mouth to feed, another complication. I almost told you to ride on. Why didn't you? Because you looked as lost as I felt. And I thought, maybe we could be lost together for a little while. Maybe that would be better than being lost alone. And now? She smiled. Now I don't feel lost anymore. January arrived with temperatures that made December seem mild by comparison. The cold was the kind that killed. Livestock froze in their stalls, water froze solid in minutes, and going outside meant risking frostbite in the time it took to walk from cabin to barn. Jonas did his best to keep the animals warm, moving them all into the barn and stuffing every gap with hay for insulation. He brought in extra wood, stacking it by the cabin door so they wouldn't have to go far when the fire needed feeding. He checked their supplies daily, rationing carefully, making sure they had enough to last until spring. But he couldn't stop worrying, couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, some threat he couldn't quite identify. Then, on a night when the wind howled like a living thing and the temperature dropped low enough to make the cabin walls crack, Jonas woke to the smell of smoke. He was out of his bedroll and moving before his mind fully processed the danger. Through the barn's gaps, he could see flickering orange light that had no business being there. He grabbed his coat and boots, not bothering to lace them properly, and threw open the barn door. The fire had started in the hay stored against the barn's north wall and was spreading fast, feeding on dry timber and racing toward the stalls where the animals were trapped. The horses were screaming, their panic filling the air with a sound that made Jonas's blood run cold. He ran inside despite the smoke, despite the heat that singed his eyebrows, and started throwing open stall doors. Buck burst out first, wild-eyed and snorting, followed by Jonas's mare. The milk cow was harder. She'd backed into a corner and refused to move until Jonas grabbed her halter and physically dragged her toward the door. The chickens were a lost cause, their coop already engulfed, their panicked sounds cutting off one by one as the smoke took them. Jonas made one more sweep through the barn, checking for animals he might have missed, and that's when the roof beam gave way. He heard it crack, had maybe half a second to register the sound, and then something massive slammed into his shoulder and drove him to his knees. Pain exploded through his body, white-hot and all-consuming. Through the agony and smoke, Jonas could hear voices shouting, Lydia screaming his name, Caleb crying. He tried to answer, tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. Then hands were on him, pulling, dragging him backward through the smoke and heat. He had a confused impression of Lydia's face, streaked with soot and tears, and then he was outside in the snow, and the cold air hit his lungs like knives. "Jonas! Jonas! Stay with me!" Lydia's voice cut through the fog in his head. "Caleb, get water! Molly, stay back from the fire!" Jonas blinked up at her, confused. "The animals, they're out. You got them all out." She was running her hands over him, checking for injuries. When she touched his left shoulder, Jonas nearly passed out from the pain. "Your shoulder's dislocated. This is going to hurt." "It already hurts. It's going to hurt more." She positioned herself behind him, her hands finding the correct grip. "On 3. 1. She wrenched his arm on 1, not 3, and Jonas heard himself make a sound he'd never made before. But the joint popped back into place, and the grinding agony settled into something merely excruciating. Behind them, the barn burned. The flames lit up the night sky, melting snow for 50 feet in every direction, painting everything in shades of orange and red. Jonas watched it burn and felt something die inside him, not just the barn, but the illusion of safety he'd been building. "Coal oil," Lydia said flatly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I can smell it from here. This wasn't an accident." Jonas knew she was right. The placement of the fire, the speed it had spread, the timing, middle of winter, when they'd be most vulnerable. This was deliberate. This was Briggs. As if to confirm the thought, Jonas's eyes caught something at the edge of the firelight. He struggled to his feet despite Lydia's protests and stumbled toward it. Pressed into the snow were hoof prints, fresh enough that they hadn't been filled in by the wind yet. 3 horses, by his count. "He tried to kill us," Caleb said, his young voice shaking. "Mr. Briggs tried to kill us." "No," Jonas said grimly. "He tried to scare us. If he'd wanted us dead, he'd have set fire to the cabin." "That's supposed to make me feel better?" Lydia demanded. It means he still thinks he can drive you off without making himself a murderer, but he's escalating. Jonas turned to face her, his shoulder screaming in protest. This won't be the end of it, Lydia. Next time might be worse. So what do we do? Jonas looked at the burning barn, at the children huddled together in the snow, at Lydia standing straight despite her fear. He thought about the gun belt she'd given him, about the promise he'd made, about the line Briggs had just crossed. Tomorrow I ride into Crooked Creek, he said. I'm going to have words with Mr. Briggs about the price of burning a man's property. Jonas, no. He'll kill you. Maybe, but I'll make sure I cost him something first. He caught her face between his hands, gentle despite his anger. I meant what I said on Christmas. I'll take care of you. I'll take care of all of you. But I can't do that if I let Briggs think he can terrorize us without consequences. Then I'm coming with you. Lydia, it's my land, Jonas. My fight. You don't get to take that from me just because you're a man and you think you need to protect me. Her eyes blazed in the firelight. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to insist she stay safe with the children. But he could see the steel in her spine, could see that she'd made up her mind, and he realized something important. She wasn't asking for his protection. She was offering partnership. Together, he agreed, but the children stay with the Hendersons. The children stay with the Hendersons, she confirmed. They spent the rest of the night salvaging what they could from the barn's remains and moving the animals into a makeshift shelter Jonas constructed from boards and canvas. By dawn, they were both exhausted and filthy, reeking of smoke, Jonas's shoulder swollen to twice its normal size. But there was also something new between them, a shared fury, a united purpose. They'd been tested and they'd survived, and now they were going to make sure the man responsible understood his mistake. The ride to Crooked Creek took 4 hours through snow that had drifted high enough to make travel treacherous. The Hendersons had agreed to take Caleb and Molly without question. Frontier neighbors understood that sometimes a situation required both parents absent. And now Jonas and Lydia rode side by side, their breaths fogging in the bitter air. Crooked Creek was exactly what its name suggested, a town that had grown up crooked along a creek that wandered drunk through the valley. It had maybe 300 permanent residents and a shifting population of miners, cowboys, and drifters that swelled that number considerably. The main street boasted a general store, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church that saw little use, and a small building that served as both land office and courthouse. Briggs's ranch was 5 miles beyond the town, a sprawling operation that controlled more land than any 10 homesteaders combined. But on Tuesdays, according to the Hendersons, Briggs took his lunch at the Gold Strike Saloon, holding court like some medieval lord while lesser men curried favor. It was Tuesday. They found him exactly where they'd expected, sitting at a corner table with 3 of his men, a bottle of whiskey and a steak dinner spread before him. He looked up when they entered, and his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, annoyance, and finally cold calculation. "Well," he said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. The widow Rowan and her pet dog." Jonas felt Lydia tense beside him, but her voice came out steady. "We need to talk, Briggs. Somewhere private." "Anything you gotta say, you can say right here." Briggs cut into his steak, deliberately casual. "I got nothing to hide." "Fine." Lydia walked forward until she stood directly across from him. "Last night, someone set fire to my barn, killed my chickens, nearly killed my livestock, nearly killed us." "That's so. Sounds like you should be more careful with your lamps." "It was coal oil. I smelled it, and there were hoof prints in the snow. 3 riders. Lots of folks ride past homesteads, Mrs. Rowan. Don't mean anything." Jonas stepped forward. "You made a mistake, Briggs. You threatened a woman and her children, you destroyed property, and you did it in a way that makes you look like a coward who works in the dark instead of facing his enemies in the light." The saloon had gone silent. Every eye was on them now, and Briggs's face had turned the color of old meat. He stood slowly, his men rising with him. "You calling me a coward, Drifter?" "I'm calling you exactly what you are. A bully who picks on widows and hides behind his hired guns when someone stands up to him." Briggs's hand moved toward his gun, but one of his men grabbed his arm. "Boss, we got witnesses. This ain't the place." "Listen to your man. Jonas said quietly. "Because if you draw on me in front of all these people, one of us is going to die, and either way you lose. You kill me, you hang for murder. I kill you. Your empire falls apart. Is a 240-acre homestead really worth that?" For a long moment, Briggs stood frozen, rage and calculation warring on his face. Then he jerked his arm free and turned his back on them. "Get out," he growled. "Get out before I forget myself." "We're going," Lydia said. "But understand this, Briggs, that land belonged to my husband, and now it belongs to me, and I will die before I give it to you. And if you come near my children again, if you so much as ride past my property, I will find a way to destroy you. That's not a threat. That's a promise." They walked out of the saloon into the cold afternoon sun, and Jonas didn't breathe properly until they were back on their horses and moving. His whole body was shaking with adrenaline and the after effects of confrontation. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said, "or the stupidest." "Probably both." Lydia's hands were trembling on the reins. "Did we just make things worse?" "Maybe, but at least now he knows we won't just roll over. Sometimes that's worth something." They'd ridden maybe half a mile when Jonas heard the horses behind them. He turned in his saddle and cursed 4 riders, coming fast. "Ride!" he shouted to Lydia. "Make for the trees!" But Buck was carrying both their weights and couldn't match the speed of the pursuing horses. They were maybe 100 yards from the tree line when the riders caught up, surrounding them, forcing them to stop. The men weren't Briggs's usual ranch hands. These were harder types, the kind who hired out for jobs respectable cowboys wouldn't touch. The leader grinned at Jonas with a mouthful of broken teeth. "Boss wants a word with you, friend, private-like." "I said everything I need to say." "Yeah, well, the boss don't see it that way." Jonas looked at Lydia, saw the fear in her eyes, and made his decision. "Let her go. Whatever Briggs wants, it's with me, not her." "Jonas, go, Lydia. Get the children and go home. I'll be along." "I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice." Jonas turned to the leader. "She rides on, unmolested. That's the deal. You want me? You let her go." The men looked at each other, then shrugged. "Makes no difference to us. Boss wants the drifter anyway." Lydia was crying now, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Jonas, please." "Trust me," Jonas said softly. "I've survived worse than whatever these boys have planned. Go home, Lydia. I'll find my way back." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to memorize it. Then she nodded once and kicked Buck into motion. The men let her go, and Jonas watched her ride away until she disappeared into the trees. Then he turned back to face them and smiled. "Well, gentlemen, let's get this over with." They took him 3 miles off the road into a stand of bare aspens. They didn't tie him to a tree or make a big production of it. They just went to work, methodical and efficient, fists and boots, and the occasional rifle butt when Jonas stayed down too long. He tried to fight back at first, managed to break one man's nose and loosen another's teeth, but 4 against 1 was never going to end well. Eventually, Jonas stopped resisting and just concentrated on protecting his vitals, on riding out the pain, on surviving. When they finally stopped, Jonas lay in the snow coughing blood, pretty sure at least 2 ribs were cracked and possibly his jaw as well. The leader crouched beside him. "Boss says to tell you this is friendly advice. Next time won't be. Next time you won't walk away at all. Understand?" Jonas spat red into the snow. "Tell your boss, he hits like a girl." The man laughed despite himself. "You got spine, drifter. Shame it won't do you any good." He stood and looked at his companions. "Leave him his horse. Boss said we're not murderers." They rode off, and Jonas lay in the snow for a long time, taking inventory of his injuries and listening to his mare shuffle nervously nearby. Everything hurt. His shoulder was on fire, his ribs screamed with every breath, and his face felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. But he was alive. And more importantly, he was angry. It took 3 tries to get to his feet and 4 more to mount his horse. The ride back to the homestead was agony, every step sending pain jolting through his battered body. The sun was setting by the time he finally saw the cabin, its windows glowing with lamplight like a beacon in the gathering dark. Lydia was outside before he'd even dismounted, her face white with fear. "Oh God! Oh Jonas, what did they do to you?" "Nothing I haven't survived before." He tried to smile and felt his split lip crack open again. Should see the other guy. This isn't funny. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. Jonas let her help him down from the horse, leaning on her more than he'd like to admit. That's what matters. Inside, she cleaned his wounds with gentle hands while he sat at the table and tried not to groan. The children were still at the Hendersons, thankfully. He didn't want them seeing him like this. We can't keep doing this, Lydia said as she dabbed at the cut above his eye. We can't keep fighting him. He's too powerful, Jonas. He'll just keep coming until one of us is dead. So what do you want to do? Sell? Give him what he wants? No, never. But there has to be another way. Jonas caught her hand, holding it still. Then we find one. Tomorrow. Tonight. I just need to rest. She looked down at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't lose you. I know we've only just... But I can't lose you, Jonas. Not after everything. You won't, he promised, pulling her close despite the pain it caused. You won't lose me, Lydia. I'm not going anywhere. She buried her face against his neck, and Jonas held her while the fire crackled and the wind howled outside. He thought about Briggs's men, about their warning, about the escalating violence, thought about how much he had to lose now and how far he'd go to protect it. Tomorrow they'd figure out their next move. Tomorrow they'd find a way to fight back that didn't end with someone dead. But tonight, Jonas just held the woman he loved and thanked whatever God might be listening that he'd lived to see her face again. Jonas woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin windows and pain that made his eyes water. Every muscle in his body had stiffened overnight, and his ribs protested with sharp agony when he tried to sit up. Lydia appeared beside him almost immediately, her hand gentle on his shoulder. Easy, she murmured. You're not going anywhere today. Can't stay in bed, Jonas managed through his swollen jaw. Work needs doing. The work can wait. You can't. She helped him ease back down, her expression brooking no argument. Besides, I've been thinking about what you said, about finding another way to fight Briggs. Jonas looked at her through the eye that wasn't swollen shut. What kind of way? The legal kind. Lydia sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Briggs claims my land sits in the middle of his grazing territory, right? That it interrupts his operations. But David filed our homestead claim properly with the land office. We have a deed. We have rights. Rights don't mean much when the other man has money and guns. Maybe not, but they mean something. She leaned forward, intensity burning in her eyes. Mrs. Henderson told me yesterday that there's a new territorial commissioner in Crooked Creek, a man named Samuel Whitmore, appointed by the government back east. He's supposed to be honest, uncorruptible. What if we took our case to him? What if we prove Briggs has no legal claim to our land? Jonas considered this through the fog of pain. Briggs won't care about some commissioner's ruling. He will if it's public, if it's official, if it strips away his excuse for harassing us. Lydia's voice grew stronger. Right now, Briggs tells everyone we're squatters, that we're on his land. That's why no one helps us. They think we're in the wrong. But if we can prove otherwise in front of the whole town, then Briggs becomes the villain in everyone's eyes. And a man like that, a man who cares about power and reputation, that might actually hurt him. It was a long shot, but Jonas had to admit it had a certain logic. Briggs operated with impunity because everyone believed his version of events. Change that narrative, and you change the game. We'd need proof, Jonas said. Documentation, survey records. David kept everything. Every paper, every receipt, every filing. Lydia stood and crossed to a wooden chest in the corner. She opened it and began pulling out documents, spreading them across the table. It's all here. The original homestead claim, the survey markers, the deed signed by the land office. David was meticulous about records. Jonas forced himself out of bed, ignoring his body's screaming protests, and joined her at the table. The documents were yellowed but legible, carefully preserved in oilcloth. He shuffled through them, his experienced eye picking out the relevant details. Your northwest boundary marker is placed at the Cottonwood Fork, he said, pointing to the survey description. That's a natural landmark. Hard to dispute. And the eastern boundary follows the creek bed for exactly 1 mile before turning south. Lydia traced the line with her finger. David walked every inch of this property before he filed. He made sure there were no overlaps, no disputes. What about Briggs's claim? Does he have paperwork showing ownership of adjacent land? I don't know, but if he does, it should be filed with the land office too, public record. Lydia looked at Jonas, hope and fear warring in her expression. If we can compare his boundaries with ours, if we can show they don't overlap, then he's got no legal leg to stand on. Jonas nodded slowly. It's worth a try. When's this commissioner holding office hours? Every Wednesday and Friday. Tomorrow's Wednesday. Jonas looked down at himself, bruised, battered, barely able to stand upright. I'm not sure I'm in any condition to make a good impression on a government official. Then it's good you won't be going alone. Lydia gathered the documents into a neat stack. We'll collect the children from the Hendersons, make sure they're settled, and then we ride to Crooked Creek first thing in the morning, together. Lydia, after what happened yesterday, is exactly why I'm going with you. She met his gaze steadily. We're partners in this, Jonas. You said so yourself. That means we face things together, the dangerous parts and the legal parts both. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to insist she stay safe at home. But he was learning that Lydia Rowan was not a woman whose mind changed once made up. Besides, she was right. They were partners now in every way that mattered. All right, he conceded. We go together, but I'm bringing my rifle, and you're staying where I can see you. Deal. She smiled, then leaned down and kissed his forehead gently, careful of his bruises. Now rest. You look like death warmed over. Feel like it too, Jonas admitted, but he was smiling as he said it. The next morning dawned cold but clear, the kind of crystalline winter day where everything seemed sharper, more defined. Jonas's face was a spectacular canvas of purple and yellow bruises, but the swelling had gone down enough that he could see properly, and his jaw only hurt when he talked, which he planned to do sparingly. They left at first light after making sure Caleb and Molly were settled back at home, with stern instructions not to leave the cabin and to bar the door behind them. Mrs. Henderson had agreed to check on them around noon, which eased some of Lydia's worry, but not all of it. They'll be fine, Jonas said as they rode toward town. It's just a few hours. I know, I just hate leaving them, especially after... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The land office was a small building on the east end of Crooked Creek's main street, distinguished from the surrounding structures only by the official seal painted on its door. Inside, a clerk sat at a desk piled high with papers, looking harassed and overworked. Help you? He asked without looking up. We're here to see Commissioner Whitmore, Lydia said. It's regarding a land dispute. That got his attention. The clerk looked up, his eyes widening slightly when he saw Jonas's battered face. Do you have an appointment? No, but the matter is urgent. Mr. Harlan Briggs has been making false claims about the boundaries of our homestead. At the mention of Briggs's name, the clerk's expression became carefully neutral. I see. And you are? Lydia Rowan. This is Jonas Hale. We hold the deed to a homestead 15 miles northeast of here. The clerk made a notation in his ledger. Wait here. I'll see if the commissioner has time. He disappeared through a door at the back of the room, leaving Jonas and Lydia standing in uncomfortable silence. Through the window, Jonas could see people moving along the street, going about their business. A few glanced at the land office, curiosity evident on their faces. Half the town probably knows we're here already, Jonas murmured. Good, Lydia replied. Let them know. Let them see we're not afraid. The clerk returned, looking slightly surprised. Commissioner Whitmore will see you now, but be warned. He's a busy man. State your case clearly and concisely. They followed him through the door into a larger office where a man sat behind an imposing desk covered with maps and documents. Samuel Whitmore was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent his life hearing both sides of every story and trusting neither. He looked up as they entered, his sharp eyes taking in Jonas's injuries with a flicker of something, concern, perhaps, or calculation. Mrs. Rowan, Mr. Hale, my clerk says you're having trouble with Harlan Briggs. Whitmore gestured to two chairs. Sit. Tell me everything. Lydia laid out the situation with remarkable clarity. David's death, Briggs's demands that she sell, the escalating harassment, the barn fire, the beating. She presented each fact without embellishment or emotion, letting the events speak for themselves. Whitmore listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled under his chin. When she finished, he turned to Jonas. "And you, Mr. Hale? What's your stake in this?" "I work Mrs. Rowan's homestead," Jonas said carefully, "and I intend to marry her, with her permission. That makes her troubles my troubles." Something shifted in Whitmore's expression, not quite approval, but a slight warming. "I see. And you believe Briggs set that fire?" "I know he did." "No. His men as good as admitted it when they were using me for a punching bag." "Can you prove any of this?" "Not in a way that would hold up in court," Jonas admitted. "But I can prove that Mrs. Rowan's land claim is legitimate and that Briggs has no legal right to demand she leave." He nodded to Lydia, who spread their documents across the desk. Whitmore examined them with the careful attention of a man who knew his business, occasionally making notes or consulting one of the maps on his wall. "Your husband's survey work was thorough," he said finally. "These boundaries are clearly marked and properly filed. The claim is valid." "Then Briggs has no legal basis for his harassment," Lydia said. "Legally, no, but that's rarely stopped men like Briggs before." Whitmore sat back in his chair. "I've been in this territory for 3 months, and in that time I've heard Briggs's name attached to no fewer than 6 disputes with smaller landholders. In every case, those landholders eventually sold or simply abandoned their claims." "We won't," Jonas said flatly. "Admirable. Also possibly fatal." Whitmore's expression was grave. "I can make an official ruling on your boundaries. I can put it in the public record that your homestead is legally held and that Briggs has no claim to it, but I can't stop him from burning your barn or hiring men to beat you. I have no enforcement power beyond documentation." "Documentation is a start," Lydia insisted. "Right now, people think we're in the wrong. They think we're squatters or troublemakers. An official ruling changes that." "It might. Or it might just make Briggs angrier." Whitmore studied them both. "Are you prepared for that possibility?" Jonas and Lydia exchanged a look. In it passed a whole conversation about fear and courage, about the life they were trying to build, about how far they were willing to go to protect it. "We're prepared," Lydia said. "Make the ruling, Commissioner." Whitmore nodded slowly. "All right. I'll need a few days to review everything thoroughly and file the official determination. Come back Friday morning. I'll have a signed document establishing your boundaries and confirming your legal claim. And Mrs. Rowan?" "Yes?" "I suggest you make copies and keep them somewhere safe. Men like Briggs have been known to make inconvenient documents disappear." They thanked him and left, stepping back out into the winter sunshine. Jonas felt lighter somehow, as if the meeting had lifted some weight he'd been carrying. It wasn't over, far from it, but at least now they had a path forward that didn't involve violence or surrender. "We did it," Lydia said quietly. "We actually did it." "We took the first step," Jonas corrected. "Now comes the hard part." "Which is?" "Surviving until Friday." They were halfway back to the horses when a voice called out behind them. "Well, well, the widow and the drifter." Jonas turned to find one of Briggs's men, not one of the 4 who'd beaten him, but someone from the saloon confrontation. The man lounged against a post, picking his teeth with casual menace. "You two just don't learn, do you? Boss is going to be real interested to hear you've been crying to the commissioner." "Then run along and tell him," Jonas said evenly. "We've got nothing to hide." "Yeah? Well, maybe the boss has something to say about that. Maybe he'll want to have another conversation, private-like." Jonas took a step forward, and despite his injuries, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, there must have been something in his eyes that gave the man pause. He straightened, his hand dropping to his gun. "Easy now," the man said, "just delivering a message." "Message received." Jonas didn't back down. "Now here's one for your boss. We're done running. We're done being scared. He wants our land, he can come take it himself instead of sending boys to do a man's work. You understand?" The man's face flushed red, but he didn't draw. After a tense moment, he spat in the dirt and walked away, throwing one last look over his shoulder. "You just made things worse," Lydia said once he was gone. "Things were already as bad as they could get. At least now Briggs knows where we stand." Jonas took her arm gently. "Come on. Let's get home before someone decides to make good on that threat." The ride back was tense, both of them watching the horizon for signs of pursuit. But the trail remained empty, the winter landscape peaceful in its deception. They made it home without incident to find Caleb and Molly safe inside, playing quietly by the fire while Mrs. Henderson worked on some mending. "Any trouble?" Lydia asked as she shed her coat. "Quiet as a church," Mrs. Henderson replied, "though I did see riders pass by around mid-morning. 3 of them, moving north. Didn't stop or slow down, but they looked at the place real careful-like." Jonas and Lydia exchanged glances. Briggs was keeping tabs on them. The question was what he'd do with that information. That night, after the children were asleep, Jonas and Lydia sat by the fire making plans. They needed to be ready for anything. Another attack on the property, an ambush on the road, legal maneuvering if Briggs tried to challenge Whitmore's ruling. "We should go back to town on Friday with witnesses," Lydia said. "The Hendersons, maybe some of the other homesteaders. Make it a public event. The more people who know about the ruling, the harder it'll be for Briggs to make it disappear." "Good thinking," Jonas poked at the fire, watching sparks spiral upward. "I've also been thinking we should get married before the ruling comes through." Lydia's head jerked up. "What?" "If we're married, I have legal standing as your husband. I can represent the homestead in court if it comes to that. I can make decisions about the property without needing separate authorization." Jonas kept his eyes on the fire, suddenly uncertain. "It's practical, is all I'm saying. Makes things cleaner legally." "Jonas Hale, are you proposing to me for legal convenience?" He finally looked at her, and something in his chest tightened at the expression on her face. "No, I'm proposing to you because I love you, because I can't imagine being anywhere else but here with you and your children building something that lasts. The legal benefits are just a bonus." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "You love me?" "Of course I love you. How could I not?" Jonas reached for her hand. "I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. Not really. I know I've got nothing to offer you except a strong back and a willingness to work. But Lydia, you and those kids, this place, it's the first thing in my whole life that's felt like home. And if you'll have me, I'd like to make it official." She was crying now, but smiling through it. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you, you impossible man. But not for legal convenience." "No?" "No. Because I love you too. Because you rode up to my clothesline 3 months ago and saw me, really saw me, not as a burden or a problem, but as a person worth knowing. Because you've been kinder to my children than they had any right to expect. Because when trouble came, you didn't run. You stayed and you fought, and you're still here." She squeezed his hand. "So yes, Jonas Hale, I'll marry you." Jonas pulled her close and kissed her, gentle because of his split lip, but fervent enough to convey everything he felt. When they broke apart, they were both smiling like fools. "Friday then," Jonas said, "after we get the ruling. We'll have the preacher marry us right there in town, with witnesses. Make it all official and legal and impossible to undo." "Friday," Lydia agreed, "our wedding day and the day we beat Briggs. That's something to look forward to." Thursday passed with agonizing slowness. Jonas worked around the homestead, his body still aching but functional, while Lydia made quiet preparations for the wedding. Nothing fancy, just a clean dress, and some wildflowers preserved from autumn. They told the children that evening, and Caleb's whoop of joy probably carried all the way to Crooked Creek. "You're going to be our real pa?" he asked Jonas, his eyes huge. "If that's all right with you." Caleb launched himself at Jonas, wrapping his arms around his waist. "That's more than all right. That's perfect." Molly was quieter, but she brought Jonas her stones and placed them carefully in his hand, then nodded solemnly, as if sealing a bargain. That night, Jonas barely slept. He kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. Briggs interfering with the ruling, violence at the land office, some legal technicality he hadn't foreseen. But he also thought about Lydia sleeping in the next room, about Caleb and Molly who'd be his children come tomorrow, about the life spreading out before him like a map of territory he'd never expected to explore. When dawn finally came, it felt like liberation. They dressed carefully, wanting to look respectable for both the land office and the wedding. Lydia wore a dark blue dress that had been her best before widowhood, and Jonas had his new shirt and David's gun belt polished until the leather shone. The children were scrubbed until they gleamed. The Hendersons met them on the road with two other homesteading families, the Carters and the Wilsons, all of them dressed in their Sunday best and ready to stand witness. It made a small parade heading into Crooked Creek, and Jonas could see curtains twitching as they rode down the main street. Commissioner Whitmore was waiting for them, and if he was surprised by the crowd, he didn't show it. He gestured everyone into his office, which quickly became cramped with bodies. "I've completed my review," Whitmore announced, holding up an official-looking document thick with seals and signatures. "Based on the survey records, original land patents, and territorial maps, I hereby confirm that the property known as the Rowan Homestead, consisting of 240 acres in Township 12 North, Range 7 East, is legally and properly claimed by Lydia Rowan, widow of David Rowan. The boundaries are as follows." He read out the technical description while Jonas watched Lydia's face. She stood straight and proud, her children pressed close to her sides, listening as a government official validated everything her husband had built and everything she'd fought to keep. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, "I find no evidence of conflicting claims or boundary disputes with adjacent properties. Any assertion to the contrary is without legal merit and should be disregarded." He looked directly at Lydia. "Mrs. Rowan, this is your land. No one can take it from you except through legal proceedings, and based on my review, there are no grounds for such proceedings." Lydia's voice shook when she spoke. "Thank you, Commissioner. You have no idea what this means." "I think I do." Whitmore handed her the document. "I'm having this filed in triplicate. One copy for you, one for the territorial records, and one for my personal files. I suggest you guard yours carefully." "I will, sir. I promise." They filed out into the sunshine, and Jonas felt like he could finally breathe properly for the first time in days. They had proof now. They had legitimacy. They had... Well, isn't this cozy? Harlan Briggs stood in the middle of the street with 6 of his men ranged behind him. He looked at their group with undisguised contempt, his eyes finally settling on the document in Lydia's hands. "What's that you got there, Mrs. Rowan? More papers saying you own land that rightfully belongs to me?" "This paper," Lydia said clearly, loud enough for the growing crowd of townspeople to hear, "says my land belongs to me, signed and sealed by the Territorial Commissioner. Your claims have been reviewed and rejected, Mr. Briggs. You have no legal right to my property." Briggs's face went red. "Legal right? I don't need legal right. I have power. I have men. I have everything I need to take what's mine." "Threaten her again," Jonas said quietly, stepping forward, "and I'll make sure everyone here hears it. You'll be admitting to harassment, intimidation, and property destruction in front of 20 witnesses." "You think I care about witnesses? You think some government paper means anything out here?" Briggs laughed, harsh and ugly. "This territory belongs to men strong enough to hold it, and you two are not strong enough." "Actually," Commissioner Whitmore said, appearing in the land office doorway, "that paper means quite a lot. It means the United States government recognizes Mrs. Rowan's claim. It means any attempt to forcibly remove her constitutes a federal offense. It means, Mr. Briggs, that you've just threatened a lawful property owner in front of a government official and multiple witnesses." The street had gone silent. Even Briggs's men looked uncomfortable now, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. Briggs pointed at Whitmore. "You think you can come here with your Eastern rules and your government authority and change how things work? This is my territory, mine. I built it when men like you were still sucking at your mother's teat." "And yet the law applies here all the same," Whitmore replied calmly. "Continue your harassment of the Rowans, and I will personally ensure that federal marshals become involved. Is that really what you want, Mr. Briggs? Federal attention on your land claims and business practices?" It was a threat, barely veiled, and everyone knew it. Briggs stood there shaking with rage, his options narrowing by the second. He could back down and look weak, or he could escalate and risk federal intervention that might uncover God knew what questionable dealings. Finally, he spat in the dirt. "This isn't over. Papers or no papers. This isn't over." He stalked away, his men following, and the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Jonas heard the word federal repeated several times, saw people nodding and looking at Lydia with new respect. "You just made an enemy for life," Jonas told Whitmore quietly. "I've made worse." The commissioner smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm tired of men like Briggs thinking they're above the law. Someone needs to stand up to them. And if it's going to be me, so be it." "Thank you," Lydia said. "For everything." "Just doing my job, Mrs. Rowan." Whitmore tipped his hat. "Good luck to you both." After he left, the Hendersons and the other families crowded around, offering congratulations and promising to spread word of the ruling far and wide. It was, Jonas realized, exactly what they'd hoped for: public validation that would make it much harder for Briggs to act without consequences. "Now then," Mrs. Henderson said briskly, "I believe there's a wedding to attend." The church was small and drafty, its windows letting in streams of winter light that painted everything in shades of gold. Reverend Thomas, a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, agreed to perform the ceremony with the kind of quiet joy that suggested he didn't get many happy occasions in his line of work. Jonas stood at the front of the church, his hands sweating despite the cold, and watched Lydia walk toward him with Caleb and Molly at her sides. She wasn't wearing white. Practical considerations made that impossible. But she was beautiful, her face radiant with happiness that made his chest ache. The ceremony was simple. They spoke the traditional vows, their voices steady and sure. And when Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Jonas kissed his bride while their children cheered and their friends applauded. Afterward, outside in the winter sunshine, Jonas found himself holding his new family close. Lydia pressed against his side, Caleb clutching his hand, Molly tugging at his coat until he picked her up. They stood there together, this makeshift family held together by choice and courage and love. And Jonas felt something settle deep in his soul. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. This was home. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked softly. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," Jonas replied honestly, "and that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." "You already do." She smiled up at him. "You already do, Jonas." They rode home as the sun set, painting the snow in shades of pink and orange. The homestead appeared on the horizon like a promise, smoke rising from the chimney, the temporary shelter Jonas had built for the animals standing sturdy against the evening wind. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was theirs, legally and officially and in every way that mattered. And tomorrow they'd start building again. A proper barn to replace the one that burned, additions to the cabin to make room for their growing family, a life that would stand as testament to their refusal to surrender. But tonight, Jonas carried his sleeping daughter into the cabin while his wife held their son's hand, and together they crossed the threshold into their future. Whatever came next, whatever threats Briggs leveled or hardships winter brought, they would face it together, as partners, as family, as home. The first week of marriage passed in a strange mixture of domestic normalcy and tense anticipation. Jonas rebuilt the animal shelter into something more permanent, while Lydia worked on expanding their winter stores. Caleb had taken to calling Jonas Pa, with an ease that made Jonas's throat tight every time he heard it, and Molly had started speaking more, her small voice emerging like a bird testing its wings after a long silence. But underneath the peaceful routine, they both felt it, the waiting. Briggs had been too quiet since the confrontation in town. Men like him didn't accept defeat gracefully, and the silence felt more ominous than any threat. "He's planning something," Jonas said one evening as he cleaned his rifle by lamplight. "No man makes the threats he made and then just walks away." Lydia looked up from the sock she was darning. Maybe Whitmore scared him off. Maybe the threat of federal marshals was enough. Maybe. But Jonas didn't believe it, and he could tell Lydia didn't either. The answer came 3 days later when Mrs. Henderson arrived at dawn, her face pale and her hands shaking as she climbed down from her wagon. "There's talk in town," she said without preamble. "Briggs has hired a lawyer from Helena. A real snake of a man, according to Mr. Henderson. They're saying he's found some kind of loophole in your land claim, something about the original survey being flawed. They're planning to challenge Whitmore's ruling." Jonas and Lydia exchanged looks. "On what grounds?" Lydia asked. "I don't know the details, but people are saying Briggs is confident. He's been buying drinks at the saloon, telling everyone that you'll be gone by spring one way or another. After Mrs. Henderson left, Jonas saddled Buck and rode hard for Crooked Creek. He found Commissioner Whitmore in his office, surrounded by maps and looking troubled. "Mr. Hale," Whitmore said, "I was about to send for you. We have a problem." "Briggs's lawyer." "You've heard?" Whitmore pushed a stack of papers across his desk. "He's filed a formal challenge claiming that the original survey of your wife's property was conducted improperly. He's arguing that the northwest boundary marker, the Cottonwood Fork, has been misidentified, and that the actual property line runs half a mile further south, which would place most of your cabin and barn on unclaimed territorial land." Jonas felt his stomach drop. "That's insane. David Rowan walked every inch of that property. His survey was meticulous." "I know, I've seen his work, but this lawyer, Charles Blackwood, is very good at finding technical irregularities. He's arguing that the surveyor David hired wasn't properly licensed at the time of the original survey, which would invalidate the whole claim." "Was he licensed?" Whitmore hesitated. "That's the problem. I can't find records confirming it either way. The surveyor was a man named Thomas Gaines, and he worked throughout the territory for years. But if his license had lapsed when he conducted your survey, then we lose everything." Jonas gripped the edge of the desk. "There has to be something we can do." "There is. We fight it in court. I've scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks from today. You'll need to present evidence supporting the validity of your survey, and Briggs will present his challenges. A territorial judge will make the final determination." "What are our chances?" Whitmore's expression was grim. "Honestly, 50-50 at best. Blackwood is good, and Briggs has deep pockets. He can afford to drag this out, file appeal after appeal." "Can you?" Jonas thought about their meager savings, about the children who needed food and clothes, about the harsh reality of winter that didn't care about legal proceedings. "No, we can't." "Then we need to make sure we win the first time." Whitmore stood and crossed to his wall map. "The key is the Cottonwood Fork. If we can definitively prove that your boundary marker is correctly placed, then the question of the surveyor's license becomes moot. The land is where it is, regardless of who documented it." "How do we prove that?" "We need the original survey notes, not just David's copies, but Thomas Gaines's official records. If those notes clearly identify the Cottonwood Fork and provide measurements from other known landmarks, we can establish the boundary independently." Whitmore turned back to Jonas. "Do you know where Gaines is now?" "No idea." "Then we need to find him, and we need to do it in the next 2 weeks." Jonas rode back to the homestead with his mind racing. Finding one surveyor in the vast Montana territory in the middle of winter seemed impossible, but impossible had never stopped him before. He'd survived worse odds. When he told Lydia what they were facing, she went very still, her hands frozen in the bread dough she'd been kneading. "They're going to take it," she whispered. "After everything, they're going to take it anyway." "No." Jonas caught her flour-dusted hands in his. "No, they're not. We're going to find Thomas Gaines, and we're going to prove that survey was done right, and we're going to win this." "How? How do we even start looking?" "We ask." Jonas squeezed her hands gently. "Someone in this territory knows where Gaines went. Surveyors don't just disappear. They work. They have reputations. They leave trails. We just have to follow it." Over the next 3 days, Jonas rode to every homestead and ranch within 20 miles, asking about Thomas Gaines. Most people remembered him, a careful, methodical man who'd surveyed dozens of properties throughout the territory, but no one had seen him in over a year. Finally, on the 4th day, Jonas found a lead. An old prospector named Silas McKenna remembered hearing that Gaines had given up surveying after his eyesight started failing and had moved south to live with his daughter near Virginia City. Virginia City was 100 miles away through mountain passes that could be treacherous in winter. Jonas knew the trip was risky, knew that leaving Lydia and the children alone was dangerous with Briggs still circling, but they had no choice. "I'm going with you," Lydia announced when Jonas told her his plan. "Lydia, no. The children need you here, and the trip's too dangerous." "The Hendersons will take the children, and I'm not letting you ride into the mountains alone in winter, Jonas Hale. We're partners, remember? That means I go where you go." Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to keep her safe at home, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew any protest would be futile. Besides, a part of him was grateful not to face this alone. They left at dawn the next morning after tearful goodbyes with Caleb and Molly. The children were scared. They'd already lost one father, and the fear of losing another was written plainly on their faces. But they were also resilient in the way children needed to be on the frontier. "You come back," Caleb said fiercely, hugging Jonas tight. "You promised you wouldn't leave." "I'm coming back," Jonas assured him. "Count on it. This is just a trip, not goodbye." Molly pressed something into his hand, a new stone, this one white with veins of pink. "For luck," she whispered, and Jonas's eyes stung as he pocketed it carefully. The ride to Virginia City took 4 brutal days. They pushed hard, camping rough at night, their breath freezing in the air as they rode through mountain passes where one misstep could send horse and rider tumbling into ravines far below. Twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through snow so deep it came up to their knees. But they made it. Virginia City sprawled across a gulch, a mining town past its boom days but still clinging to survival. Jonas asked around until he found Gaines's daughter's house, a small structure on the edge of town. The woman who answered their knock was in her 40s, her face lined with care. When Jonas explained why they'd come, she hesitated. "My father's not well," she said. "His mind wanders sometimes, and his eyes are nearly gone. I don't know if he can help you." "Please," Lydia said. "Our home, our children's future. Everything depends on finding those survey notes. We've ridden 4 days through the mountains. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't desperate." The daughter's expression softened. "Come in, but don't tire him too much." Thomas Gaines sat in a chair by the fire, a blanket over his knees, his eyes clouded with cataracts. But when Jonas explained who they were, the old man's face lit up with recognition. "Rowan Homestead," he said, his voice thin but clear. "I remember it. Beautiful property. That cottonwood fork was distinctive. Used it as the primary marker because it wasn't going anywhere. Trees like that live for centuries." "Mr. Gaines," Jonas said, kneeling beside the old man's chair, "there's a lawyer claiming your survey was invalid because your license had lapsed. Do you remember what year you surveyed the Rowan property?" "Spring of 1876, late April, I think, and my license was good. I renewed it that March in Helena, paid the fee, and everything." Gaines's clouded eyes tried to focus on Jonas's face. "Are they trying to take the Rowan land?" "Yes, sir. A man named Harlan Briggs. He's challenging the survey in court." "Briggs?" Gaines's mouth twisted. "I know that name. He tried to hire me once to fudge a boundary on a homestead he wanted. I refused, and he threatened to ruin my reputation. Is that what this is about?" Jonas and Lydia exchanged startled looks. "You think he's targeting us because of his grudge against you?" "Wouldn't surprise me. Briggs is the kind of man who carries grudges to his grave." Gaines reached out, and his daughter placed his hand on Jonas's arm. "My survey was accurate, young man. Every measurement, every marker. I kept copies of everything." "Do you still have those copies?" "In the chest in my room. Sarah, get the surveying chest." Gaines's daughter hurried away and returned with a battered wooden chest. Inside were dozens of carefully rolled documents, each one labeled and dated. She sorted through them until she found what they needed. "Here," she said, unrolling the papers. "Rowan Homestead Survey, April 1876. Complete with all measurements, landmarks, and calculations." Jonas scanned the documents with growing relief. Everything was there, precise distances from the cottonwood fork to other natural landmarks, calculations that would be impossible to dispute, even a sketch map showing the property in relation to surrounding terrain. "Mr. Gaines," Lydia said, her voice thick with emotion, "would you be willing to testify in court to confirm these measurements?" The old man nodded slowly. "If you can get me there, I'll testify. I won't let Briggs steal land using my name as an excuse. I've got enough sins to answer for without adding that to the list." They stayed the night in Virginia City, and the next morning they began the journey back with the survey documents carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and Thomas Gaines riding behind them in a hired wagon driven by his daughter, who'd insisted on coming to look after him. The return trip was even harder than the first. The weather had worsened, and they were moving more slowly to accommodate Gaines and the wagon. But Jonas felt hope burning in his chest like a coal. They had evidence. They had testimony from the surveyor himself. They had a fighting chance. They reached Crooked Creek with 2 days to spare before the hearing. Commissioner Whitmore nearly wept when he saw the documents, and after examining them thoroughly, he declared them to be exactly what they needed. "This survey is ironclad," he said. "The measurements are precise, the methodology is sound, and having Gaines himself here to testify. Blackwood won't know what hit him." The hearing was held in the largest room available, the back room of the Gold Strike Saloon, hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. Every seat was filled with townspeople who'd come to watch the spectacle, and more stood outside in the cold, pressing against the windows. Judge Harold Thornton presided, a severe man in his 60s who'd seen enough frontier disputes to be thoroughly cynical about all parties involved. He sat behind a borrowed desk with a gavel that looked like it had been used more often to hammer nails than maintain order. Briggs sat at one table with Charles Blackwood, a man who looked exactly like what he was, expensive, smooth, and utterly without conscience. They both looked confident, almost bored, as if this were merely a formality before their inevitable victory. At the other table sat Jonas and Lydia, with Commissioner Whitmore beside them as their advocate. Thomas Gaines sat behind them, his daughter at his side, looking small and old and determined. Judge Thornton banged his gavel. "Let's get this started. Mr. Blackwood, you've challenged the validity of the Rowan homestead claim. Present your case." Blackwood stood with practiced ease. "Thank you, Your Honor. The matter is quite simple. The defendant claims ownership of land based on a survey conducted by Thomas Gaines in 1876. However, our investigation has revealed that Mr. Gaines's surveying license had expired in February of 1876, a full 2 months before he supposedly conducted this survey. Under territorial law, a survey conducted by an unlicensed surveyor is invalid, which means the land claim is void." He presented documents, licensing records from Helena showing Gaines's previous license and its expiration date. It looked damning, and Jonas saw Lydia's hand tighten on the table. "Furthermore," Blackwood continued, "the survey in question relies heavily on a single landmark, a so-called Cottonwood Fork, which has never been properly verified. Without a valid survey and without clear boundaries, this property reverts to unclaimed territorial land, which my client intends to incorporate into his existing holdings." "Mr. Whitmore?" Judge Thornton said. Response? Whitmore stood, and Jonas was struck by how calm he looked. "Your Honor, Mr. Blackwood's information is incomplete. While it's true that Thomas Gaines's previous license expired in February 1876, he renewed that license in March of the same year, a full month before conducting the Rowan survey. He presented documents of his own, a renewal certificate from the Helena Land Office, complete with official seals and signatures, showing that Gaines's license had been properly maintained." Blackwood's confident expression flickered. "Your Honor, we had no knowledge of any renewal." "Perhaps you should have done more thorough research," Whitmore interrupted smoothly. "The records are public. You simply didn't look hard enough." Judge Thornton examined the renewal certificate carefully. "This appears to be in order. What about the boundaries issue?" "I'm glad you asked." Whitmore gestured to Jonas, who stood and placed the carefully preserved survey documents on the judge's desk. "These are Thomas Gaines's original survey notes for the Rowan property, including precise measurements from the Cottonwood Fork to multiple other landmarks. A rock outcropping to the east, a creek bend to the south, a distinctive hill to the west. These measurements can be independently verified today. The land is exactly where the survey says it is. And to address any remaining questions about the validity of this survey," Whitmore continued, "we have Mr. Gaines himself present to testify." A murmur ran through the crowd. Briggs's face went red, and he leaned over to hiss something at Blackwood, who looked like he'd just swallowed something bitter. "Mr. Gaines," Judge Thornton called, "can you approach?" Thomas Gaines stood with his daughter's help and made his way slowly to the front. His clouded eyes couldn't see the judge clearly, but his voice was strong when he spoke. "I conducted the Rowan survey in late April 1876, Your Honor. My license was current and valid. I spent 3 days on that property, taking measurements and verifying boundaries. The Cottonwood Fork is distinctive and unmistakable, twin trunks splitting from a single base, each one over 3 feet in diameter. I chose it as the primary marker because it was permanent and easily identifiable. Every measurement I took, every calculation I made, is documented in those notes. The survey is accurate. Mr. Gaines, Blackwood interjected, given your failing eyesight, how can we trust your memory of events from nearly 2 years ago? My eyes are failing now, Gaines replied sharply. They were perfect in 1876, and I remember the Rowan survey specifically because of what happened afterward. What happened? Judge Thornton asked. Harlan Briggs came to me about 2 months later, told me he'd pay me double my normal fee to adjust the Rowan boundaries to exclude the homestead cabin, said it would be a simple matter to claim I'd made an error in the original survey. Gaines turned his clouded gaze toward where Briggs sat. I refused, told him I wouldn't falsify records for any amount of money. He threatened me then, said he'd ruin my reputation and make sure I never worked in the territory again. The room erupted. People were shouting, some in outrage, others in vindication. Judge Thornton hammered his gavel until order was restored. Mr. Briggs, the judge said coldly, do you deny this allegation? Briggs shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. That old man's memory is faulty. He's been put up to this by these squatters and their government friend. I never... Because I have witnesses, Gaines interrupted. 2 men who were present when Briggs made his offer. Jacob Wheeler and Samuel Ross. Both of them worked as surveyor's assistants, and both of them heard everything. Are these men available to testify? Judge Thornton asked. Wheeler's dead, Gaines said. Died last winter, but Ross is alive and working out of Fort Benton. I sent him a telegram before we left Virginia City. He confirmed every word and said he'd testify if needed. Blackwood had gone pale. Briggs was sputtering, trying to form words, but nothing coherent emerged. The lawyer leaned over and whispered urgently to his client, and Jonas saw the exact moment Briggs realized he'd lost. Judge Thornton studied the documents before him for a long moment, then looked up at the crowd. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Thomas Gaines's survey of the Rowan homestead was conducted properly by a licensed surveyor and is therefore valid and binding. The boundaries as established in the original survey are confirmed, and Lydia Rowan's claim to said property is upheld in full. He turned his gaze to Briggs. Furthermore, I find the attempt to challenge this claim to be without merit and potentially fraudulent. Mr. Briggs, you are hereby ordered to cease all harassment of the Rowan family and to stay off their property. Any violation of this order will result in contempt charges and possible criminal prosecution. The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo through the entire room. They'd won. The crowd exploded into noise, some cheering, others arguing, everyone talking at once. Jonas felt Lydia's hand find his, squeezing so hard it hurt. And when he looked at her, she was crying and laughing at the same time. We did it, she whispered. Jonas, we actually did it. You did it, Thomas Gaines said, turning toward them with a smile. You fought for what was right. That takes courage. Briggs stormed out of the room, Blackwood following, and Jonas watched them go with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness. They'd won the legal battle, but men like Briggs didn't give up easily. As if reading his thoughts, Commissioner Whitmore appeared at his elbow. He'll try something else, he murmured. Maybe not immediately, but eventually. Men like him always do. Let him try, Jonas said. We'll be ready. But the retaliation Jonas expected didn't come. Days passed, then weeks, and while Briggs's men occasionally rode past the homestead, they never stopped, never made threats. It was as if the court defeat had finally broken something in Briggs's determination, or perhaps he'd simply decided the fight wasn't worth the cost. Winter deepened into its coldest months, and Jonas threw himself into work with renewed purpose. He and several neighboring homesteaders, inspired by the Rowans' victory, joined together to rebuild the barn, everyone contributing labor and materials. In 3 weeks, they'd constructed something better than what had burned, with a proper loft and reinforced walls that would stand for decades. Caleb and Molly thrived. Caleb grew taller seemingly by the day, learning everything Jonas could teach him about ranching and hunting and surviving on the frontier. Molly spoke more freely now, her vocabulary expanding as her confidence grew, and she'd started following Lydia around the cabin, learning to cook and sew and manage a household. And Lydia bloomed. The constant fear that had shadowed her face since David's death gradually faded, replaced by something that looked like peace. She laughed more easily, touched Jonas more freely, and sometimes he'd catch her humming while she worked, a sound so domestic and content it made his chest ache. One February evening, as they sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed, Lydia took Jonas's hand and placed it on her stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Jonas felt his heart skip. "Are you?" "Yes." Her smile was radiant. "We're having a baby. Come late summer, probably August." Jonas couldn't speak. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, and marveling at the life growing between them. A child. Their child. A new beginning made flesh. "Are you happy?" Lydia asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Jonas managed, terrified and grateful and overwhelmed and happier than I've ever been in my entire life. She laughed, pulling back to look at him. "Good. Because Caleb and Molly are going to need help taking care of a baby. I'm counting on you, Pa." Jonas kissed her then, deep and slow, and thought about the baby they'd made, about the family they were building, about how impossibly far he'd come from that lonely man on a lame horse who'd ridden up to a clothesline on an October afternoon. Spring came with sudden warmth, melting snow, and revealing land that had been frozen for months. Jonas plowed the garden plot and expanded it, planning for the larger family they'd need to feed. He built an addition onto the cabin, a proper bedroom for Caleb and another for Molly, giving everyone more space. Neighbors stopped by regularly now, no longer keeping their distance the way they had when Lydia was just a widow struggling alone. The Rowans had become a fixture in the community, respected and valued, and Jonas found himself serving as informal advisor to other homesteaders facing their own challenges. In late April, Commissioner Whitmore rode out to the homestead with unexpected news. "Briggs is leaving the territory," he announced without preamble. "Selling his ranch and moving back east. His health's failing, apparently, and he's decided he's done with Montana." Jonas and Lydia exchanged stunned looks. "Is this certain?" Lydia asked. "Completely. The sale's already underway. He'll be gone by summer." Whitmore smiled. Seems that court defeat broke more than his legal case. Broke his reputation, too. Once people heard about his attempted bribery, about his harassment of homesteaders, the other ranchers started keeping their distance. Man can't operate without respect, and Briggs finally realized he'd lost his. After Whitmore left, Jonas and Lydia stood in their yard, looking out over land that was finally, truly, permanently theirs. "It's over," Lydia said wonderingly. "It's actually over." "It's over," Jonas confirmed, "and our life is just beginning." The baby came on a sweltering August afternoon, arriving with a lusty wail that could probably be heard in Crooked Creek. Mrs. Henderson and two other neighboring women assisted with the birth while Jonas paced outside with Caleb and Molly, trying not to wear a groove in the dirt. When Mrs. Henderson finally emerged, her face was beaming. "It's a boy, healthy and strong, with a good pair of lungs. And your wife's fine, just tired." Jonas nearly knocked her over in his haste to get inside. Lydia lay in bed, sweaty and exhausted, and more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, holding a tiny wrapped bundle. She looked up as Jonas entered, her smile weary but radiant. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Jonas approached almost reverently, peering down at the small red face visible above the blanket. The baby's eyes were scrunched shut, his tiny fists waving, and Jonas felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was his son. His blood, his legacy, his future. "What should we name him?" Lydia asked. Jonas thought about it, about the journey that had brought him here, about all the people who'd shaped his life. "David," he said finally, "after your first husband. He built this place, gave you those children. It seems right to honor him." Tears slipped down Lydia's cheeks. "David Jonas," she said, "for both the men who made our family possible." "David Jonas Hale," Jonas agreed, carefully taking the baby from Lydia's arms. "Welcome home, son." Caleb and Molly were allowed in then, and they crowded around to see their new brother, their faces alight with wonder. Molly reached out one careful finger to touch the baby's hand, and David's tiny fingers wrapped around hers instinctively. "He's holding me!" she exclaimed, delighted. "He knows his sister," Jonas said, his voice rough with emotion. That evening, after the visitors had left and the children were asleep, Jonas sat by the window holding his son while Lydia rested. The sun was setting over the Montana prairie, painting everything in gold and crimson, and the homestead stretched before him, the rebuilt barn, the expanded cabin, the fields ready for harvest. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, wandering aimlessly, with no purpose and no hope. Thought about how close he'd come to riding past this place entirely, to never stopping, to missing out on everything that mattered. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked drowsily from the bed. Jonas looked down at his sleeping son, then over at his wife, then toward the room where Caleb and Molly slept peacefully. "I'm thinking about that day I rode up to your clothesline, how I almost kept riding, how easily I could have missed all of this." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Jonas stood and carried the baby over to the bed, carefully placing him in Lydia's arms before lying down beside them both. "I saw a woman hanging laundry and children playing, and I saw something I didn't even know I wanted. A family. A home. A reason to stop running." Lydia shifted closer, her head on Jonas's shoulder, the baby between them. "Home wasn't a place for you, was it? It was us." "It was you," Jonas corrected softly. "All of you. You and Caleb and Molly, and now little David. You're my home, Lydia. The first real home I've ever had." "And you're ours," she whispered. "Our protector, our partner, our family. Everything we needed without knowing we needed it." Outside, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, wild and beautiful and harsh. Winter would come again, bringing its own challenges. There would be hard years ahead, drought or disease or simple bad luck. There would be struggles and sorrows, the inevitable costs of building a life on the frontier. But there would also be laughter and growth and small daily miracles. There would be watching Caleb grow into manhood, seeing Molly become her own person, raising David to know the value of hard work and honest dealing. There would be more children, perhaps, and eventually grandchildren, a legacy that would echo down through generations. There would be a life worth living, built by two people who'd been broken by loss and made whole by love. Jonas held his family close as darkness fell and the stars emerged, brilliant pinpoints in the vast Montana sky. The cowboy who'd ridden up to a lonely homestead searching for nothing more than water had found everything instead: purpose and belonging, courage and grace, and most of all, a family to call his own. He was home at last, and home was exactly where he intended to stay. The end.